Team Amazing this side, and Team Rockstar on this side. Okay, obviously I have no ripple effect whatsoever. I was expecting like 50% this side, and maybe 100% that side once they got the hang of it, but I guess not. Anyways, our meeting started off way up here, with Mark started talking about the accomplishments of this club, and as part of this general evaluator and evaluations that are done in this club, I think it helps to excel our club to that level of expertise and great leaders and speakers. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first evaluator, Mr. Gary Penn, who's going to evaluate our first speaker of the evening.
Third speech. How many people have been in the club long enough to give more than 3 speeches by a show of hands? About half the club. When you get to your third speech, you're normally fumbling a little bit, but you're starting to get technique. And that is not what we saw tonight. We saw a fantastic speech tonight. It was extremely polished, and it used a lot of techniques that only seasoned speakers really are able to do. An example of that I thought really stood out was eye contact. Every single person in the room, from what I saw, got eye contact, and that is really, really difficult to do. And the pacing of the speech was phenomenal. We got a story about going to Nashville, about a family, about personal angst. And then that was turned into a life lesson that then brought us back full circle to the title of the speech. So the whole thing from end to end was extremely well structured. And I really, really congratulate you on that. It was excellent. There are 3 things that I think you could improve that I'm going to bring up because you are already speaking as a seasoned speaker, and so I think you can handle these things. One is your motion with your body. Your neutral position tends to be here. And that was great when you were bringing up things. You specifically used unconditional love as a gesture. And I thought that gesture, unconditional love, that was a great gesture. But the rest of the time you were kind of holding your hands here without reason. And I would recommend that you bring them down to neutral, which just brings your audience, it lets your audience in as opposed to protecting yourself from the audience. The second item was your blocking. And blocking is movement on stage from A to B. You stuck to one side, and I think that was unintentional. I think you wanted to use the whole space, but your speech was kind of bringing you back and forth. One way to bring yourself out of blocking that sometimes works is to structure your speech so that you actually block it in 2 ways. So you could potentially have Nashville be here, and then you could have the philosophical aspect of love be here. And so you can tell the story and then be the narrator in 2 different ways. The third thing that I think you could do is pace it evenly throughout. Your pacing was really, really good for 80%. There was just one area with Lady Gaga that I got really lost because you kind of sped up, you started talking about materials, and I didn't really understand what was going on. So if you could kind of slow the whole thing down to what you did the other 80% of the time, it would be perfectly paced. One of the things that I really, really enjoyed is that you brought it full circle. You actually asked me to look at this, and you ended with the title, and the title brought it home, not only to the audience, but with emotion. Extremely, extremely well done. Congratulations.
I was so impressed with that evaluation.
Yeah.
Our next evaluation will be done by Jason Rush.
My ripple effect, you didn't give My ripple effect it takes place the night before of my next day. So if I choose to have a glass or 2 of wine or get to bed late, then the next day is all downhill from here. So I live a pretty boring life. I get up really early due to my job, so need to make sure I'm extremely lame the night before. the time that I'm an evaluator against Robert and Gary, I lose. And I loved your speech. It hit me in so many places. I worked for a company that was a startup, that had all the perks and had all the table tennis, had the Taco Tuesday. I loved all those things that you mentioned. Watched it go from a fun startup, which I was, I don't know, the fourth person in the door, been there for 10 years, go to a private equity bought, lame, 650 person company without any soul. And it's like that right now. The only reason I'm still there is because I'm remote and I live here in San Diego. The speech was extremely well delivered. I sat in the back. I don't like sitting in the back. I sat in the back to make sure I could hear you perfectly. You did great with volume, like you did great with your hand gestures, great with eye contact. You're obviously a veteran doing this. This is probably your 58th speech. So on to the nitpicking, which I'm sure you want to hear. You asked me about pace. You were great. You asked me about structure, seamless, did great. Everything you asked me to kind of watch makes sense, informative, not boring, all those things, check, check, check. The only thing I would remove is the top 10. I don't understand why you needed that. I love the interactiveness of the speech. I thought it was great that you started off with that. It was really clever. I love that you asked people why you love your job. I just didn't understand the top 10. It was also tricky too because I was sitting in the back to hear what the top 10 was. But we can blame it on you. So. What else can I say? I think the end of it, it felt a little flat to me. Obviously the time is always annoying. When you see that green light, you're like, kill it, go for it, go for it. At least I do. It felt a little bit of an impossible solution to me at the very end, where you said, well, you know, if you don't quit your job right now, but try to think of ways to go somewhere where you can be happy. And I was like, okay, well, now what am I supposed to do? You know, obviously, I hate my job, 87%, but what am I supposed to do tomorrow? So I was on my way to writing out my resignation. And you gave me that, and then you said, don't do it. So it's a little bit tricky on the way. Other than that, it was a great speech. Thank you so much.
Evaluating our third speech is Mr. Robert Perry.
My ripple effect, you all have felt my intensity. It's gravitational. It's tidal. It's like the pull of the moon to the ocean. That is my impact. Madam Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, and welcome guests. What you didn't know about Ghazala's speech this evening, or probably didn't know, was that it was bumped up a full week. Also, this wasn't really Ghazala's icebreaker. She came back to the club. So you're looking at a speaker that's already fairly polished, but she's starting to take it to a whole new level. How about that introduction? Have you ever been held at gunpoint? It's hard to beat an introduction like that. And this level of anxiety and intensity was building and building. And then all of a sudden she cut it with that humor about how long is this going to take? I have a test to take tomorrow. Way to switch it up. That's a very experienced speaker's tool. Setting that kind of tone, that kind of mood, and changing it on the dime for the audience. From there, it was just this roller coaster ride that was propelling us forward to where you are today. How you got here. The level of intensity, the level of pressure never stopped from being at gunpoint. You know, bringing the books into the labor and delivery room. You know, the tests that you had to take to become a doctor. Coming into this new, foreign place, and it's just amazing to me what brought you here today. A couple things that you could work on. This was already a terrific speech, but a few things that would make it even better and take it to that next level would be, first off, that intensity was what made the speech wonderful, but there are points where you need to dial it back a little. And it did almost feel like that energy, it kind of runs over some of our audience. You can only take it for so long. And you could have had so much more impact when you were talking about the transition of coming here, to the US, and kind of how there might have been a pause and a shift at that point in time. Also, I noticed you were really trapped here in the center of the room. You moved over side to side a little bit, but you were kind of like this caged lion who was caught right here in the middle, and planting firmly and continuing to speak would have really heightened the impact. And one last thing, we talked about introductions. I think you almost had it. You were using filler words a little bit in the introduction, and I think it was just nervousness where you said, And if you had just been able to hold that pause, stare at the audience, look into people's eyes, and say, have you ever been held at gunpoint? That would have had so much more impact than that or the that was in there. But overall, you're an advanced speaker already. I'm so pleased you've returned to our club, and I can't wait to see where this journey takes you next.
Hey, Mr. Perry. Now we are going to get a timer's report on the evaluators to see if they qualify.
Everybody qualified.
And now I'd like to get a up counter report.